Picture this. You're floating 250 miles above Earth in the International Space Station. Everything's peaceful. You're looking down at our beautiful blue planet when suddenly alarms start blaring throughout the station. Red lights flash everywhere. Mission Control's panicked voice crackles through, "All crew to storm shelter immediately. Major solar event incoming. You have less than 20 minutes." This isn't a movie scene. This is real life for astronauts, and it happens more often than NASA wants you to know. What you're about to discover will shock you, because while everyone's worried about asteroids and space debris, there's an invisible killer stalking every human who dares leave Earth's protective bubble. And the scariest part? Most people have never even heard of it. The astronaut's worst nightmare. Right now, astronaut Frank Rubio is aboard the ISS. He's been up there for over a year, and in that time, he's hidden in the station's storm shelter more times than he can count. What's he hiding from? Invisible bullets of radiation traveling at nearly the speed of light. When a solar storm hits, astronauts don't just feel a little uncomfortable. They literally watch their radiation exposure monitors climb into the danger zone in real time. It's like watching your Geiger counter go crazy while you're trapped in a metal box with nowhere to run. But here's the truly terrifying part. During the massive solar storm of August 1972, NASA calculated that if astronauts had been traveling to the moon at that exact moment, they would have received a lethal dose of radiation, not might have gotten sick. They would have died, and this storm hit just 4 months after Apollo 16 and 4 months before Apollo 17. Pure luck saved those astronauts' lives. The storm shelter on the ISS isn't some high-tech radiation bunker. It's basically the most cramped, claustrophobic corner of the station, where the walls are slightly thicker. When the alarms go off, 6 highly trained astronauts squeeze into a space the size of a small closet and wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, all while invisible death particles slam into their temporary metal coffin. But what NASA doesn't tell you is that even inside the storm shelter, astronauts are still getting irradiated. The shelter only reduces exposure by about 50% moles, which means during a major solar storm, they're still receiving radiation doses equivalent to hundreds of chest X-rays. The walls of the ISS are so thin that high-energy particles punch right through them like they're made of tissue paper. And the psychological toll is devastating. Imagine being trapped in a metal box, knowing that invisible death is streaming through your body, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. Some astronauts have reported panic attacks during shelter protocols. Others describe the experience as waiting to die in space. The medical data is even more disturbing. Every astronaut who spends more than 6 months in space shows measurable DNA damage. Their chromosomes develop breaks and rearrangements that persist for years after returning to Earth. Their cancer rates are significantly elevated. Their immune systems are permanently compromised. Scott Kelly spent 340 days in space and came back with his DNA literally altered by radiation. His identical twin brother Mark stayed on Earth as a control subject. The results were horrifying. Scott's chromosomes were damaged, his immune system was compromised, and his cognitive abilities had deteriorated. And that was during relatively calm space weather. Now imagine what happens during a major solar storm. But here's what should terrify everyone. Astronauts on the ISS are actually in one of the safest places in space. Earth's magnetic field still provides some protection at that altitude. Future astronauts traveling to Mars will have no such protection. They'll be completely exposed to the full fury of space radiation for months or even years. The radiation environment on a Mars mission would be so severe that NASA estimates a 50% chance of fatal cancer for crew members. That's not a small risk, that's a death sentence with a coin flip. Yet space agencies are still planning to send people on these missions, essentially asking volunteers to commit slow suicide for the advancement of science. the government's secret space weather war room. While you're going about your daily life, there's a facility in Boulder, Colorado that operates like a military command center. It's called the Space Weather Prediction Center, and they're tracking something that could end modern civilization as we know it. They have direct hotlines to power companies, airlines, satellite operators, and government agencies. When their computers detect incoming solar storms, they don't issue public warnings on the news. Instead, they make classified phone calls to CEOs and military commanders. Why the secrecy? Because they know that if the public really understood how vulnerable we are, there would be panic. But the real operations happen in rooms you'll never see. Deep inside NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain complex, military personnel monitor space weather 24/7 as part of national defense. They track every solar flare, every coronal mass ejection, every fluctuation in Earth's magnetic field, because they know that space weather isn't just a scientific curiosity, it's a weapon of mass destruction waiting to be deployed. The Space Weather Operations Center has protocols for different threat levels. During minor storms, they simply monitor conditions. During moderate storms, they issue warnings to critical infrastructure operators. But during major storms, they implement what's called DEFCON space weather, a classified alert system that puts the entire military on high alert for electronic warfare attacks disguised as natural space weather events. Think about it. If a hostile nation somehow triggered a massive solar storm that destroyed our satellites and collapsed our power grid, how would we even know it wasn't natural? Space weather provides the perfect cover for the ultimate sneak attack. The military has contingency plans for extended space weather emergencies that read like science fiction novels. They include protocols for governing the country without electronic communication, maintaining military readiness without satellite navigation, and coordinating disaster response using nothing but hardened radio systems from the Cold War era. But here's the most disturbing part. These contingency plans assume that some infrastructure will survive, that some communications will remain operational, that some semblance of government authority will persist. In reality, a true Carrington-level event would destroy the very systems needed to implement any response plan. Every time you fly, especially on routes over the North Pole, your airline is secretly monitoring space weather. They track solar storms more carefully than regular storms because a single solar flare can expose passengers to radiation levels equivalent to multiple chest X-rays. Flight crews on polar routes receive radiation doses comparable to nuclear power plant workers. But here's what's really disturbing. Airlines routinely reroute flights because of space weather, but they never tell passengers the real reason. They'll say it's air traffic control delays or weather conditions. What they don't say is that they're avoiding flying through an invisible radiation storm that could give everyone on board cancer. The aviation industry has known about this problem for decades, yet they've successfully kept it hidden from public consciousness. They've lobbied against radiation exposure limits for passengers, argued that the health risks are acceptable, and consistently downplayed the dangers of cosmic radiation exposure. Flight attendants and pilots have some of the highest occupational radiation exposures of any profession. They receive more radiation per year than workers at nuclear power plants, yet they have no protective equipment, no dosimetry badges, and no medical monitoring. The industry treats them as expendable casualties in the name of maintaining flight schedules. Some pilots and flight attendants have developed unusual cancers at alarming rates, but the aviation industry has managed to keep this information from becoming a major news story. They've successfully convinced most people that flying is completely safe, while secretly monitoring deadly space radiation on every flight. The most shocking revelation comes from internal airline documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. These documents show that airlines have detailed models predicting radiation exposure for different flight routes and altitudes during various space weather conditions. They know exactly which flights are dangerous and when, yet they continue operating these flights without warning passengers. During major solar storms, radiation levels at typical cruise altitudes can increase by 1,000% or more. A single transcontinental flight during a severe space weather event can expose passengers to more radiation than multiple CT scans. Yet airlines continue flying through these storms, gambling with passenger health to avoid costly delays and rerouting. And it gets worse. Classified military documents reveal that the US government has been researching space weather as a potential weapon since the 1960s. The idea is simple but terrifying. If you could somehow trigger or direct solar storms, you could disable an enemy's satellites, power grids, and communication systems without firing a single conventional weapon. The researchers focused on several approaches: high-powered radio transmitters that could destabilize the ionosphere, nuclear explosions in space that could create artificial radiation belts, and directed energy weapons that could damage satellites during natural space weather events. While we don't have the technology to control space weather yet, some researchers quietly wonder if certain mysterious satellite failures and communication blackouts in recent years might have been early tests of space weather weapons. Of course, proving this is impossible. Nice space weather provides the perfect cover for electronic warfare, but the implications are terrifying. If one nation develops the ability to weaponize space weather, they would possess the ultimate doomsday weapon mind. The power to destroy modern civilization without leaving any physical evidence of an attack. The target nation would simply experience what appeared to be a natural disaster, while their entire technological infrastructure collapsed around them. Intelligence agencies take this threat seriously enough to have established classified programs monitoring foreign space weather research. They track which nations are building powerful radio transmitters, launching unusual satellites, or conducting suspicious scientific experiments in space. The arms race has already begun. We just don't know which nations are participating or how far they've progressed. By the time we find out, it may already be too late. The planet that lost everything, Mars's terrifying secret. 4 billion years ago, Mars looked almost exactly like Earth. It had blue oceans, flowing rivers, and an atmosphere thick enough to support life. Spacecraft have found evidence of ancient beaches, river deltas, and lake beds. Mars wasn't just habitable, it was actually inhabited by flowing water and possibly even primitive life. Then something catastrophic happened, and the evidence of what killed Mars should terrify everyone on Earth. Mars lost its magnetic field. Without that invisible shield, the solar wind, a constant stream of charged particles from the sun, began stripping away Mars's atmosphere molecule by molecule. Over millions of years, the oceans boiled away into space. The rivers dried up. The air became so thin that water could no longer exist as a liquid on the surface. But here's what makes this story truly horrifying. We can watch it happening in real time. NASA's MAVEN spacecraft has been orbiting Mars since 2014, conducting what amounts to a forensic investigation of planetary murder. It's watching Mars die, measuring exactly how the planet loses its atmosphere to space with each passing day. The data is devastating. Mars is currently losing about 100 grams of atmosphere every second. That might not sound like much, but over geological time, it's catastrophic. MAVEN has observed the process accelerating during solar storms. When the sun gets angry, Mars dies a little faster. The spacecraft has detected massive plumes of atmospheric gas being torn away from the planet during solar events. Imagine standing on Mars during a solar storm and watching your planet's air streaming away into space above your head. That's the reality facing any future Mars colonists. But the implications for Earth are even more terrifying. The same process that killed Mars is already beginning to affect our planet. Earth's magnetic field has been weakening for the past 200 years. The magnetic poles are wandering erratically, and the field strength has declined by about 15% globally. In some regions, the field has weakened by as much as 30%. Scientists studying ancient magnetic field data have discovered that Earth's magnetic field has completely reversed many times throughout history. During these reversals, which can take hundreds or thousands of years to complete, the magnetic field becomes extremely weak, sometimes dropping to just 10% of its normal strength. During the next magnetic reversal, Earth could temporarily lose most of its protection from space weather. The consequences would be catastrophic: massive increases in cosmic radiation reaching the surface, widespread failure of electronic systems, and the beginning of atmospheric loss processes, similar to what happened on Mars. Some researchers believe we may already be in the early stages of a magnetic reversal. The rapid movement of the magnetic poles and the formation of unusual magnetic anomalies over the South Atlantic could be warning signs that the field is preparing to flip. If this reversal coincides with a period of high solar activity, Earth could experience space weather events far more severe than anything in recorded history. The combination of a weak magnetic field and strong solar storms could strip away significant portions of our upper atmosphere, just like what happened to Mars billions of years ago. The timeline wouldn't be human. Mass atmospheric stripping takes millions of years, but the process would be irreversible. Once Earth starts losing its atmosphere to space, there's no way to stop it. Our blue skies would gradually turn black. Our oceans would slowly boil away. Earth would become a dead, frozen desert, just like Mars is today. But even before the atmospheric loss becomes significant, the weakening magnetic field would make space weather events far more dangerous. Solar storms that are merely inconvenient today would become civilization-ending catastrophes as our magnetic shield continues to deteriorate. The astronauts floating above us are experiencing a preview of Earth's future. As our magnetic protection weakens, everyone on Earth will eventually need the kind of radiation shielding that astronauts use today. We'll all be living inside storm shelters, hiding from the invisible death streaming down from space. And unlike the astronauts, we won't have mission control watching over us, ready to issue warnings when the next storm arrives. We'll be on our own, trapped on a slowly dying planet, watching our atmosphere bleed away into the cosmic darkness. The question isn't whether this will happen, it's whether human civilization will still exist when it does. The planet that died, Mars's terrifying warning. 4 billion years ago, Mars looked almost exactly like Earth. It had blue oceans, flowing rivers, and an atmosphere thick enough to support life. Spacecraft have found evidence of ancient beaches, river deltas, and lake beds. Mars wasn't just habitable mine, it was actually inhabited by flowing water, and possibly even primitive life. Then something catastrophic happened, and the evidence of what killed Mars should terrify everyone on Earth. Mars lost its magnetic field. Without that invisible shield, the solar wind, the constant stream of charged particles from the sun began stripping away Mars's atmosphere molecule by molecule. Over millions of years, the oceans boiled away into space. The rivers dried up. The air became so thin that water could no longer exist as a liquid on the surface. But what scientists discovered when they started studying Mars up close was far more horrifying than anyone expected. The planet didn't die slowly and peacefully. It was murdered in a cosmic catastrophe that lasted millions of years. NASA's MAVEN spacecraft, which has been orbiting Mars since 2014, has been conducting what amounts to a forensic investigation of planetary homicide. What it found reads like the autopsy of a world that was literally torn apart by space weather. The data shows that Mars is still dying right now. Today, as you read this, the planet is losing about 100 grams of atmosphere to space every second. That might not sound like much, but over geological time, it's devastating. NASA's MAVEN spacecraft has watched this process happening in real time like witnessing a planetary murder in slow motion. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. The death rate accelerates during solar storms. When the sun unleashes a coronal mass ejection toward Mars, Maven watches massive plumes of Martian atmosphere get ripped away into space. During major solar events, Mars can lose as much atmosphere in a few hours as it normally loses in months. The spacecraft has captured images that will haunt you: streams of oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon dioxide flowing away from Mars like rivers of air bleeding into space. These aren't computer simulations. These are real-time photographs of a planet dying. Scientists have reconstructed what happened to Mars during its death throes billions of years ago. The planet experienced a period of intense solar bombardment mined storms far more powerful than anything Earth has ever recorded. These superstorms, each one equivalent to thousands of Carrington events happening simultaneously, stripped away most of Mars' atmosphere in a relatively short period. But here's what should make every person on Earth lose sleep. Mars had a much thicker atmosphere than Earth does today when the stripping began. If Mars, with its dense primordial atmosphere, could be reduced to a near vacuum by solar storms, what would happen to Earth's much thinner atmosphere during a similar bombardment? Today, Mars is losing about 100 grams of atmosphere to space every second. That might not sound like much, but over geological time, it's devastating. NASA's Maven spacecraft has watched this process happening in real time, like witnessing a planetary murder in slow motion. But here's the truly frightening part. Earth's magnetic field isn't permanent. It's generated by molten iron swirling in our planet's core, and that process is gradually weakening. Earth's magnetic field has already weakened by 15% in the last 200 years. If it continues to weaken, or if it suddenly flips, which has happened before, we could end up just like Mars. The magnetic field data is terrifying when you understand what it means. Earth's magnetic poles are currently moving at unprecedented speeds. The North Magnetic Pole is racing across the Arctic at about 35 miles per year. This isn't normal geological behavior. It's a sign that the magnetic field is becoming unstable. Scientists studying paleomagnetic data have discovered that Earth's magnetic field has completely reversed hundreds of times throughout the planet's history. During these reversals, which can take anywhere from a few hundred to several thousand years to complete, the magnetic field strength drops to as little as 10% of its normal intensity. We may already be in the early stages of such a reversal. The South Atlantic anomaly, a region where the magnetic field is significantly weaker than normal, has been growing larger and more pronounced. Satellites passing through this region experience increased radiation damage and electronic malfunctions. Without our magnetic shield, the next major solar storm wouldn't just knock out our power grids and satellites. It would begin the slow process of stripping away our atmosphere. First the hydrogen would go, then the oxygen. Our blue skies would gradually turn black. Our oceans would slowly boil away into space. The process wouldn't happen overnight. Atmospheric stripping takes millions of years even under the worst conditions. But once it begins, it's irreversible. There's no technology that could stop it. No engineering solution that could save our atmosphere once the magnetic shield fails. The timeline wouldn't be humanine. It would take millions of years, but the process would be irreversible. Earth would become a dead, frozen desert, just like Mars is today, and there's nothing we could do to stop it. But even before the atmospheric stripping becomes significant, a weak magnetic field would make life on Earth's surface increasingly difficult. Cosmic radiation levels would spike, making certain regions uninhabitable. Electronics would fail regularly due to increased particle bombardment. The ozone layer would be depleted, allowing deadly ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface. Scientists have found evidence that Mars lost most of its atmosphere during a period of intense solar activity billions of years ago. multiple massive solar storms, far more powerful than anything we've experienced in recorded history, may have delivered the final blows to the Martian atmosphere. The isotopic ratios in Mars' remaining atmosphere tell the story of its violent death. Lighter isotopes were preferentially stripped away by the solar wind, leaving behind a concentration of heavier isotopes that serves as a fingerprint of atmospheric loss. It's like finding DNA evidence at a crime scene, misproof positive that Mars was murdered by space weather. Now consider this chilling fact. Our Sun is a relatively young active star. As it ages over the next billion years, it will actually become more active, not less. The solar storms that killed Mars may have been just a preview of what's coming for Earth. Solar evolution models predict that our Sun will gradually increase in luminosity and activity over cosmic timescales. The solar storms of the future will make today's space weather events look like gentle summer breezes. When these superstorms arrive, Earth's weakening magnetic field may not be able to protect us. And unlike Mars, we've built a technological civilization that depends entirely on the very things space weather destroys: satellites, power grids, and electronic communication. When the big one hits, not if. When none, we won't just lose our technology, we'll lose our ability to coordinate a response. Mars had no cities to lose power, no satellites to be destroyed, no internet to go dark. When its atmosphere was stripped away, only the planet itself suffered. When Earth's magnetic field fails and the atmospheric stripping begins, human civilization will collapse long before the atmosphere is gone. The astronauts floating above us right now are the canaries in the cosmic coal mine. Every time they hide in their storm shelter, they're experiencing a preview of humanity's future, because sooner or later, we're all going to need a storm shelter. But unlike the astronauts, we won't have mission control watching over us, ready to issue warnings when the next storm arrives. We'll be on our own, trapped on a slowly dying planet, watching our magnetic shield fade and our atmosphere begin its inexorable journey into space. The question isn't whether space weather will end our technological civilization. The question is whether we'll be ready when it happens. And based on how little most people know about this threat, the answer should terrify you. The Carrington event, when nature nearly ended civilization. Let me take you back to September 1st, 1859. A British astronomer named Richard Carrington is doing what he does every morning, sketching sunspots through his telescope. But today is different. Today he's about to witness something that will change history forever. As Carrington watches through his telescope, he sees something impossible, a brilliant white flash erupting from the surface of the sun. It's so bright that it outshines the sun itself. He can barely believe his eyes. He's just become the first human in history to directly observe a solar flare. But Carrington has no idea what he's just witnessed. He doesn't know that he's watching the birth of the most powerful space weather event in recorded human history. He doesn't know that the flash of light he's observing will, within hours, unleash electromagnetic chaos across the entire planet. What happened next should have been a warning to humanity. But we weren't listening. The solar flare Carrington observed was just the opening act. 8 hours later, the sun launched a massive coronal mass ejection. Billions of tons of plasma and twisted magnetic fields hurled into space at incredible velocity. This invisible cloud of destruction raced across the 93 million miles between the Sun and Earth in just 17 hours, traveling at nearly 5 million miles per hour. When this magnetic hurricane slammed into Earth's magnetosphere, the results were unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. The collision compressed Earth's magnetic field so violently that the magnetosphere, normally extending far beyond the Moon's orbit, was crushed down to just 7,000 miles above the planet's surface. Within 18 hours, the entire planet was under siege by an invisible enemy. Telegraph lines across North America and Europe started sparking violently. Operators received electric shocks that left burn marks on their hands. Some telegraph offices caught fire as the wires overloaded with electrical current that seemed to come from nowhere. In Boston, telegraph operator William Barton was knocked unconscious when a surge of electricity arced from his telegraph key. In Philadelphia, sparks from telegraph wires set fire to the office of a major newspaper. Across Europe, telegraph networks failed simultaneously, as if some invisible enemy had declared war on human communication. But here's the truly bizarre part. Some telegraph systems worked better during the storm than they normally did. Operators in Boston disconnected their power supplies completely, yet their telegraphs continued to work might as powered entirely by the electrical currents induced by the magnetic storm raging overhead. One telegraph operator in Portland, Maine, was able to continue sending messages to Boston for 2 hours using nothing but the electricity generated by the geomagnetic storm. The invisible currents flowing through the earth were literally more powerful than the batteries and generators of the time. The aurora borealis, normally confined to the Arctic regions, appeared as far south as the Caribbean. Miners in the Rocky Mountains woke up thinking it was dawn because the sky was glowing so brightly. People in Rome could read newspapers by the light of the aurora at midnight. But what most people don't know is that the Carrington event created auroras with colors never seen before or since. Witnesses described deep red auroras that looked like the entire sky was on fire, purple auroras that moved like living things, and green auroras so bright they cast shadows on the ground. The electromagnetic disturbances were so severe that compasses spun wildly, becoming useless for navigation. Ships at sea found themselves lost as their magnetic navigation instruments failed completely. Some captains reported that their compass needles spun in complete circles for hours. The storm created electrical currents in the Earth itself, so powerful that they could be measured thousands of miles away from their source. Telegraph wires became antennas, picking up signals from these telluric currents, allowing operators to communicate across vast distances without any power source whatsoever. If the Carrington event happened today, our technological civilization would collapse overnight. Every satellite in orbit would be fried, GPS would disappear, the internet would go dark, power grids across entire continents would explode in cascading failures. The economic damage would be measured in the trillions of dollars, and the recovery could take decades. But the satellite destruction wouldn't be limited to communication and navigation systems. Weather satellites would fail, leaving us blind to approaching storms. Military surveillance satellites would go dark. The International Space Station would become uninhabitable as its electronics fried and its life support systems failed. The power grid failures would be catastrophic and long-lasting. The induced currents from a Carrington-level event would be strong enough to permanently damage the massive transformers that form the backbone of electrical distribution systems. These transformers take years to manufacture and replace place during a widespread failure. The wait for new transformers could exceed a decade. But here's what keeps space weather experts awake at night. The Carrington event wasn't even that unusual. Analysis of ice cores and tree rings shows that similar storms have hit Earth approximately every 500 years. We're overdue. Tree ring analysis from ancient forests reveals evidence of solar storms even more powerful than the Carrington event. The 774-775 AD event, detected through radiocarbon dating, appears to have been several times more intense than anything recorded in modern history. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica contain chemical signatures of massive solar particle events that occurred before written records. These natural archives suggest that superstorms capable of ending technological civilization strike Earth roughly once every few centuries. The terrifying reality is that we're living in a brief window of cosmic calm. The past 150 years have been unusually quiet in terms of extreme space weather. The sun has been relatively well behaved, and we've used this peaceful period to build a technological civilization that assumes space weather will never be more severe than what we've already experienced. This assumption could prove fatal. When the next Carrington-level event occurs, and it will occur, we'll discover just how fragile our technological infrastructure really is. The 2012 near miss, how close we came to Armageddon. July 23rd, 2012. Most people remember this as just another summer day, but scientists now call it the day humanity almost ended. On this date, the Sun unleashed a coronal mass ejection so powerful that researchers later compared it directly to the Carrington event. Billions of tons of plasma and magnetic fields were hurled into space at nearly 2,000 miles per second, about 4 times faster than a typical solar storm. The magnetic field structure within this coronal mass ejection was unlike anything previously recorded. The magnetic fields were twisted into complex configurations that would have been particularly effective at coupling with Earth's magnetosphere and driving severe geomagnetic storms. The only reason you're watching this video right now is pure cosmic luck. The storm missed Earth by just 9 days. If our planet had been in that region of space just 1 week earlier, you would be living in a very different world today. Dr. Daniel Baker from the University of Colorado, who led the research team studying this event, made a chilling statement. If it had hit, we would still be picking up the pieces. Think about that for a moment. A storm that happened over 93 million miles away nearly sent us back to the Stone Age, and most people have never even heard about it. But the 2012 event was even more dangerous than the Carrington storm in several crucial ways. First, it was faster, much faster. The 1859 storm took 17 hours to reach Earth, giving telegraph operators some warning as the first effects began to appear. The 2012 storm would have reached Earth in just 12–14 hours, leaving much less time for preparation. Second, the magnetic field orientation within the 2012 coronal mass ejection was perfectly aligned to cause maximum damage to Earth's magnetosphere. When a CME's magnetic field is oriented opposite to Earth's field, the interaction is much more violent, like 2 magnets repelling each other with tremendous force. NASA's analysis showed that this 2012 storm would have destroyed most satellites in orbit within hours, collapsed power grids across North America and Europe, eliminated GPS navigation worldwide, shut down the internet for months, caused trillions in economic damage, potentially killed millions due to loss of medical equipment, water pumps and food distribution systems. But these official estimates are conservative. Independent analysis suggests the damage would have been far worse. The satellite losses alone would have been catastrophic. Unlike 1859, when there were no satellites to lose, we now have over 8,000 active satellites providing everything from weather data to banking communications. A 2012-level event would have created what space scientists call a satellite apocalypse. The electromagnetic pulse generated by the storm's interaction with Earth's magnetosphere would have reached ground level with unprecedented intensity. Electronic devices not specifically hardened against electromagnetic interference would have failed en masse. Cars, computers, medical devices, and industrial control systems would have been damaged beyond repair. The power grid destruction would have triggered cascading failures throughout the entire technological ecosystem. Without electricity, water treatment plants would fail, leaving cities without clean water. Fuel pumps at gas stations would stop working, paralyzing transportation. Food distribution networks would collapse as refrigeration systems failed, and logistics became impossible. The scary part? We had no advance warning system that could have predicted this storm's intensity. Even today, our space weather forecasting is roughly where terrestrial weather forecasting was in the 1950s. Space weather prediction is fundamentally more difficult than terrestrial weather forecasting because we can't directly observe the solar corona where storms originate. We're essentially trying to predict earthquakes by looking at the surface ripples they create, while being unable to see the fault lines themselves. The lead time for coronal mass ejection warnings is typically 1–3 days, not nearly enough time to implement protective measures for critical infrastructure. Power companies need weeks to reconfigure their grids for space weather events. Satellite operators require days to put their spacecraft into safe mode. Even when we detect a dangerous coronal mass ejection, we can't predict its exact intensity until it's almost upon us. The magnetic field orientation within the CME, the critical factor determining how severely it will affect Earth, can only be measured by spacecraft positioned between the Sun and Earth, giving us less than an hour of final warning. The 2012 near miss revealed another terrifying vulnerability. Our space weather monitoring system depends on aging spacecraft that could fail without warning. The Advanced Composition Explorer, ACE satellite, which provides crucial early warning data, was already operating years beyond its design lifetime in 2012. If ACE had failed just before the 2012 event, we would have had no advance warning whatsoever. The first indication of the incoming storm would have been the failure of satellites and power grids around the world. Since 2012, we've made minimal improvements to our space weather preparedness. We've launched one new monitoring satellite and developed slightly better computer models, but we're still essentially defenseless against a Carrington-level event. The next time we might not be so lucky. The Sun is currently approaching the maximum of solar cycle 25, and early indicators suggest it may be more active than initially predicted. We're entering a period of heightened space weather risk with virtually the same vulnerabilities that made the 2012 near miss so dangerous. The secret government bunkers you'll never see. While most people are completely unaware of the space weather threat, certain government officials know exactly how vulnerable we are, and they're preparing in ways that would shock you. Deep beneath the mountains of Colorado, inside the famous NORAD facility at Cheyenne Mountain, there's a section most people never hear about: the Space Weather Operations Center. This isn't just monitoring space weather for scientific curiosity, they're preparing for space weather warfare. The Cheyenne Mountain complex was originally built to survive nuclear war, but it's been extensively modified to operate during extreme space weather events. The facility is surrounded by solid granite and encased in a steel shell designed to block electromagnetic pulses. Even the ventilation system is hardened against EMP effects. Inside this mountain fortress, military personnel monitor space weather 24/7 using systems that are completely isolated from civilian infrastructure. They have their own power generation, their own communication networks, and their own command structure that can operate independently of the outside world. The military has classified space weather as a potential weapon of mass destruction, not because we can control it, but because our enemies might eventually be able to. Imagine if a hostile nation could somehow trigger solar storms and direct them at specific regions of Earth. They could destroy our satellites, collapse our power grid, and cripple our economy without firing a single conventional weapon. But the weaponization potential goes far beyond just triggering natural solar storms. Military researchers have explored using high-powered radio transmitters to create artificial disturbances in the ionosphere that could disrupt enemy communications and navigation systems. The High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program HAARP in Alaska, while officially a scientific research facility, has capabilities that could theoretically be used to modify space weather conditions. The facility can beam enormous amounts of radio energy into the ionosphere, heating specific regions and creating localized disturbances. Other nations have built similar facilities. Russia operates the Sura ionospheric heating facility, and China has constructed massive radio transmitters ostensibly for ionospheric research. The true capabilities and purposes of these installations remain classified, but the government's preparations go much deeper than most people realize. There are hardened communication bunkers spread across the country, designed to operate during extreme space weather events. Military personnel train for scenarios where all satellite communication is lost and power grids fail across multiple states simultaneously. The continuity of government protocols include detailed procedures for maintaining federal authority during extended technological blackouts. These plans assume that normal communication and transportation systems will be unavailable for months or even years. The Strategic National Stockpile includes electromagnetic, pulse-resistant medical equipment, communication devices, and power generation systems specifically designated for use during space weather emergencies. These supplies are pre-positioned at classified locations across the country. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has classified space weather as a national security threat on the same level as terrorist attacks and nuclear war. They have contingency plans for mass evacuations of cities when power grids fail, distribution of emergency supplies when transportation networks collapse, and martial law implementation during extended technological blackouts. These plans are based on studies showing that urban populations can survive without electricity for only 3.7 days before social order begins to collapse. After 2 weeks without power, water, and food distribution, most cities would become uninhabitable. The government has identified critical infrastructure islands, massive facilities like hospitals, military bases, and emergency response centers that would be essential for maintaining civilization during a space weather catastrophe. These facilities are being hardened against electromagnetic effects and stockpiled with supplies for extended autonomous operation. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of government space weather preparation is how classified it all remains. While billions of dollars are being spent on protective measures for government and military systems, the general public receives virtually no information about how to prepare for space weather disasters. The official government position is that space weather poses minimal risk to civilian populations, despite internal studies showing that a Carrington-level event could cause millions of deaths through cascading infrastructure failures. This disconnect between public messaging and actual preparation suggests that the government views space weather as a survival of the prepared scenario. They're ensuring that essential government functions can continue during a space weather catastrophe, but they're making minimal effort to protect or prepare the civilian population. Yet, despite all this preparation at the highest levels of government, the public remains almost completely ignorant of the threat. The military has developed hardened versions of essential technologies that can operate during electromagnetic storms. These include communication systems, navigation equipment, and weapons systems designed to function when conventional electronics fail. Special forces units train regularly for missions in electromagnetically denied environments, practicing navigation and communication without GPS or radio systems. These skills would become essential for maintaining security and coordinating disaster response during a major space weather event. The Navy has begun retrofitting some ships with analog navigation and communication equipment as backup systems for when their digital electronics fail. Older sailors who learned celestial navigation are being brought back to train younger personnel in these forgotten skills. But the most secretive aspect of government space weather preparation involves offensive capabilities. Military planners have explored how space weather weapons might be used against enemy nations and how to defend against such attacks. The Pentagon has classified certain space weather research under national security restrictions, preventing public access to information that might reveal military capabilities or vulnerabilities. International treaties governing the peaceful use of outer space make no mention of space weather weapons, creating a legal grey area that some nations may be exploiting to develop electromagnetic warfare capabilities. The arms race may have already begun, hidden behind the veil of scientific research and natural disaster preparation. When the next major space weather event occurs, it may be impossible to determine whether it was natural or artificially triggered. The hidden health crisis, space weather's silent victims. What the medical establishment doesn't want you to know is that space weather is already killing people, and the death toll is accelerating. Cancer rates have been mysteriously climbing for decades, particularly certain types that are directly linked to radiation exposure. Brain tumors, leukemia, and skin cancers are all increasing at rates that can't be explained by lifestyle factors alone. But when you map these cancer increases against cosmic radiation levels and space weather activity, a terrifying pattern emerges. The regions of Earth closest to the magnetic poles, where cosmic radiation penetrates most easily through our weakening magnetic shield, show the highest rates of unexplained cancer increases. Alaska, northern Canada, Greenland, and Antarctica all report cancer statistics that are significantly above global averages. But the most disturbing evidence comes from studying populations exposed to high levels of cosmic radiation through their occupations. Commercial airline crews have cancer rates 25% higher than the general population, with brain cancer rates nearly double the norm. These aren't small statistical blips. These are clear signals that chronic radiation exposure from space weather is causing widespread health effects. The aviation industry has known about this cancer epidemic for years, but has successfully suppressed most research into the connection. Internal airline documents obtained through lawsuits reveal that companies have been tracking crew health statistics since the 1980s and are fully aware of the elevated cancer rates. Flight attendants show particularly high rates of breast cancer, skin cancer, and reproductive disorders. The combination of cosmic radiation exposure and disrupted circadian rhythms from frequent time zone changes creates a perfect storm of biological stress that dramatically increases cancer risk. But the health effects extend far beyond aviation personnel. People living at high altitudes receive significantly more cosmic radiation exposure than those at sea level. Denver, Colorado, Mile High City, measurably higher background radiation levels and correspondingly higher cancer rates than cities at lower elevations. Children are especially vulnerable to space weather radiation because their cells divide rapidly as they grow. When high-energy particles from space strike developing tissue, the damage is magnified exponentially. A single cosmic ray that might cause minor DNA damage in an adult can trigger aggressive childhood leukemia. Pediatric oncologists have quietly noticed that childhood cancer rates spike in the months following major solar storms. The correlation is subtle but consistent. Minor space weather events are followed by increased diagnoses of brain tumors and blood cancers in children. The fertility crisis that's been devastating developed nations for the past 40 years may also be linked to increasing cosmic radiation exposure. Sperm production is particularly vulnerable to radiation damage, and male fertility rates have plummeted by over 50% in Western countries since 1970. The timeline matches perfectly with the beginning of Earth's magnetic field weakening. As our planetary shield has grown less effective, more high-energy particles reach the surface and damage human reproductive systems. We may be witnessing the slow sterilization of our species by space weather. Pregnant women exposed to cosmic radiation during solar storms show higher rates of miscarriage and birth defects. The developing fetus is extremely sensitive to radiation damage, particularly during the first trimester when organs are forming. But perhaps the most insidious health effect is the gradual degradation of immune system function in populations exposed to chronic cosmic radiation. The constant low-level bombardment of high-energy particles damages white blood cells and disrupts the body's natural defense mechanisms. This immune suppression may explain the increasing prevalence of autoimmune diseases, the declining effectiveness of vaccines, and the emergence of antibiotic-resistant infections. When your immune system is constantly under assault from space radiation, it becomes less capable of fighting off other threats. The Internet apocalypse, when digital civilization dies. The Internet was never designed to survive a major space weather event, and when it fails, modern civilization will collapse within hours. Most people think of the internet as a cloud, an invisible, distributed network that can route around damage, but the physical reality is far more fragile. The internet depends on thousands of miles of fiber optic cables, underwater cables connecting continents, and massive data centers that consume enormous amounts of electrical power. During a major geomagnetic storm, the electrical currents induced in these cables can destroy the electronic repeaters that boost signals every 50-100 kilometers. When these repeaters fail, entire sections of the global network go dark simultaneously. Underwater cables are particularly vulnerable because seawater is an excellent conductor of electricity. When geomagnetic currents flow through the ocean during a solar storm, they surge through submarine cables with devastating effect. The 2003 Halloween storms damaged several transatlantic cables, causing internet outages that lasted for days. But the real catastrophe would occur at internet exchange points, the massive facilities where different networks connect to share traffic. These facilities handle enormous amounts of data and require precise timing signals from GPS satellites to coordinate traffic routing. When GPS fails during a space weather event, internet routing becomes chaotic. Data packets get lost, connections time out, and entire sections of the network become unreachable. The internet doesn't just slow down minds, it fragments into isolated islands that can't communicate with each other. The economic impact would be immediate and catastrophic. Electronic banking would freeze as financial networks lose connectivity. Stock markets would crash as high-frequency trading systems fail. E-commerce would disappear overnight, eliminating the primary revenue source for millions of businesses. But the secondary effects would be even worse. Modern supply chain management depends entirely on internet connectivity. When the network fails, shipping companies can't track cargo, factories can't coordinate with suppliers, and retail stores can't process electronic payments. The just-in-time delivery systems that keep store shelves stocked would collapse within days. Urban populations, which depend on constant resupply from distant suppliers, would face shortages of food, medicine, and essential goods almost immediately. Emergency services would be crippled by the loss of digital communication systems. 911 call centers rely on internet-based routing to dispatch first responders. Hospitals use internet connections to share patient records and coordinate with other facilities. Police departments depend on network databases for everything from license plate checks to criminal background investigations. The social effects of internet collapse would be profound and long-lasting. Entire generations have grown up assuming that instant global communication is a fundamental aspect of reality. When that capability disappears, the psychological impact could be as devastating as the practical consequences. Social media platforms that billions of people use to maintain relationships would vanish. Online education systems that millions of students depend on would become inaccessible. Remote work arrangements that allow families to maintain their standard of living would become impossible. The knowledge economy that drives modern prosperity is entirely dependent on internet connectivity. When the network fails, intellectual work becomes impossible on a global scale. The transition back to local, physical-based economic activity would be traumatic and would likely result in a permanent reduction in living standards. Even worse, the internet has become essential infrastructure for other critical systems. Power grids use internet connections for monitoring and control. Transportation systems depend on internet-based logistics. Manufacturing facilities rely on network systems for quality control and inventory management. When the internet dies during a space weather event, it won't just be a communication problem, it will trigger cascading failures throughout every aspect of technological civilization. The GPS apocalypse, when time and space disappear. Most people think of GPS as just a navigation tool for finding directions, but GPS timing signals are actually the invisible heartbeat that synchronizes all of modern civilization. When that heartbeat stops, everything falls apart. GPS satellites don't just tell you where you are, Mias. They provide precise time signals that coordinate everything from banking transactions to power grid, switching to cell phone networks. These timing signals are so accurate that they account for relativistic effects, the slight time dilation caused by the satellite's orbital velocity and reduced gravity. When solar storms damage GPS satellites or disrupt their signals, the entire infrastructure of modern society begins to desynchronize. Without precise timing, digital systems can't coordinate their operations, leading to cascading failures that propagate through every network technology. Banking systems rely on GPS timestamps to process transactions and prevent fraud. Electronic payments require precise timing to ensure that money is debited from one account before being credited to another. When GPS timing fails, electronic banking becomes impossible and the global financial system freezes. The implications go far beyond just ATM machines not working. International wire transfers depend on GPS timing to coordinate between banks in different time zones. Stock markets use GPS timestamps to sequence trades and prevent market manipulation. Credit card processing systems require GPS timing to validate transactions in real time. Without GPS timing, the entire global economy would revert to cash-only transactions, but even that wouldn't work because cash registers, point-of-sale systems, and inventory management all depend on networked systems that require precise timing coordination. Power grids use GPS timing to synchronize the switching of electrical loads across vast networks. The electrical grid is essentially a massive machine where generators, transformers, and distribution systems must work in perfect harmony. When GPS timing fails, grid operators lose the ability to coordinate these systems, forcing them to shut down entire sections of the power network to prevent catastrophic failures. The 2003 Northeast blackout, which affected 50 million people, was partly caused by a loss of timing coordination between different parts of the electrical grid. A GPS failure during a space weather event could trigger simultaneous blackouts across multiple continents. Cell phone networks depend on GPS for tower synchronization and call routing. Modern cellular systems use time division multiplexing, which requires all towers to be synchronized to within microseconds. When GPS fails, mobile phone networks become unable to coordinate calls between towers, effectively eliminating cellular communication over large areas. The internet itself depends on GPS timing for routing data packets between networks. Internet routers use GPS timestamps to determine the optimal path for data transmission and to detect network failures. Without GPS, internet traffic becomes chaotic and unreliable. But the most dangerous vulnerability is in air traffic control. Modern aircraft rely on GPS for navigation, especially during landing approaches at airports with limited visibility. The required navigation performance (RNP) procedures that allow planes to land safely in bad weather are entirely dependent on GPS accuracy. When GPS fails during a space weather event, air traffic controllers lose the ability to safely separate aircraft. The result would be the immediate grounding of most commercial aviation worldwide, stranding millions of passengers and paralyzing global transportation. Military systems are even more dependent on GPS than civilian applications. Precision-guided munitions rely on GPS for targeting. Military communications systems use GPS timing for encryption synchronization. Naval vessels depend on GPS for navigation in areas where traditional navigation aids are unavailable. The loss of GPS during a geomagnetic storm could leave military forces unable to operate effectively, creating a window of vulnerability that hostile nations might exploit. This is why space weather is considered a national security threat, equivalent to cyber attacks or terrorist actions. Even everyday activities that seem unrelated to GPS would be affected. Emergency services use GPS to locate callers and dispatch responders, Delivery services rely on GPS for routing and tracking. Construction equipment uses GPS for precision grading and surveying. The cascading effects of GPS failure would touch every aspect of modern life within hours of a major space weather event. The medical device massacre. When technology turns deadly, hospital patients around the world are being kept alive by electronic devices that were never designed to survive space weather events. When the next major solar storm hits, these devices will become death traps. Pacemakers, insulin pumps, and other implanted medical devices are extremely vulnerable to electromagnetic interference. The microprocessors that control these devices can be permanently damaged or reprogrammed by the electrical currents induced during geomagnetic storms. During the 1989 Quebec blackout, several hospitals reported pacemaker malfunctions that correlated with the peak intensity of the geomagnetic storm. Patients experienced irregular heartbeats, inappropriate shock delivery, and complete device failure. Some required emergency surgery to replace their pacemakers. Modern implanted devices are even more vulnerable because they're smaller, more complex, and use less robust electronics than older models. Insulin pumps can deliver fatal overdoses when their control circuits are disrupted by electromagnetic interference. Neurostimulators used to treat Parkinson's disease can cause severe pain or paralysis when they malfunction. Hospital equipment presents an even greater threat to patient safety during space weather events. MRI machines can become dangerous when their superconducting magnets are destabilized by geomagnetic disturbances. The liquid helium cooling systems can fail, causing the magnets to quench. Ventilators keeping critically ill patients alive can shut down when their control electronics are damaged by electromagnetic pulses. Dialysis machines can deliver incorrect fluid volumes or concentrations when their monitoring systems fail. Heart-lung bypass machines used during surgery can stop circulating blood if their pumps lose power or control signals. The most vulnerable patients are those in intensive care units, where every aspect of life support depends on electronic systems. When these systems fail simultaneously during a geomagnetic storm, ICU patients face almost certain death. Emergency backup power systems offer no protection because they're equally vulnerable to electromagnetic interference. Backup generators often fail first during geomagnetic storms because their electronic control systems are more sensitive than the main hospital power grid. Medical device manufacturers have largely ignored electromagnetic compatibility requirements for space weather events. The FDA testing standards for medical devices only require protection against much weaker electromagnetic interference than would be generated by a major geomagnetic storm. Most hospitals have no electromagnetic shielding and no hardened backup systems for critical medical equipment. When space weather strikes, they'll become places where the technology meant to save lives becomes the primary cause of death. The nuclear nightmare when atoms turn against us. Nuclear power plants represent the ultimate space weather vulnerability. Facilities that can experience catastrophic meltdowns when their control systems are disrupted by electromagnetic interference from geomagnetic storms. Modern nuclear reactors depend entirely on computerized control systems for safe operation. These systems monitor neutron flux, control rod positions, coolant temperature, and pressure levels thousands of times per second. If these electronic systems fail or provide incorrect readings, reactor operators can lose control of the nuclear reaction. The most dangerous scenario involves a loss of coolant system control during a geomagnetic storm. Nuclear reactors generate enormous amounts of heat that must be continuously removed by circulating coolant. If the pumps that circulate this coolant are disrupted by electromagnetic interference, reactor temperatures can rise rapidly toward meltdown conditions. Even more terrifying is the possibility of control rod system failure. Control rods contain neutron-absorbing materials that slow or stop the nuclear reaction when inserted into the reactor core. These rods are positioned by computer-controlled motors that could malfunction during a space weather event. If control rods are withdrawn inappropriately due to electromagnetic interference, the nuclear reaction could accelerate beyond safe limits. Conversely, if the rods become stuck in the withdrawn position due to motor failures, operators might be unable to shut down an overheating reactor. The safety systems designed to prevent nuclear accidents are electronic and equally vulnerable to space weather effects. Emergency core cooling systems, containment isolation valves, and radiation monitoring equipment could all fail simultaneously during a major geomagnetic storm. This creates a nightmare scenario where both the primary reactor control systems and the emergency safety systems are compromised at the same time. Nuclear plant operators would be flying blind, unable to monitor reactor conditions or implement protective measures. The 1989 geomagnetic storm caused significant problems at several nuclear facilities. A Hydro-Quebec power failure affected the electrical supply to nearby nuclear plants, forcing emergency shutdowns. Transformer failures at nuclear facilities created dangerous instabilities in reactor cooling systems. More recently, space weather events have triggered false alarms in nuclear plant safety systems. Radiation monitors have recorded false readings during geomagnetic storms, leading to unnecessary evacuations and emergency procedures. But a truly catastrophic scenario would involve multiple reactor failures across a large geographic region during a Carrington-level space weather event. If dozens of nuclear plants lost control simultaneously, the radioactive contamination could make vast areas uninhabitable for decades. The nuclear industry has been slow to address space weather vulnerabilities, partly because the regulatory focus has been on terrorism and human error rather than natural electromagnetic phenomena. Nuclear plants have backup power systems, but these offer no protection against electromagnetic interference that can disable control systems while leaving power supplies intact. Some older nuclear plants with analog control systems may actually be safer during space weather events than newer plants with digital systems. However, most of these older facilities are being decommissioned, leaving the nuclear fleet increasingly vulnerable to electromagnetic interference. Emergency response plans for nuclear accidents assume that communication systems, transportation networks, and government coordination capabilities will remain functional during a crisis. These assumptions would prove false during a major space weather event, potentially turning localized nuclear emergencies into regional catastrophes. The economic apocalypse, when money dies. The global economy is built on electronic systems that can be instantly destroyed by space weather, and the financial consequences of the next major solar storm will exceed anything in human history. The modern financial system is essentially a vast network of computers processing millions of transactions per second. High-frequency trading algorithms execute buy and sell orders faster than human thought, often completing trades in microseconds. These systems depend on precise timing signals from GPS satellites and constant connectivity through fiber optic networks. When a major geomagnetic storm disrupts GPS timing and damages communication networks, financial markets don't just slow down, they crash in spectacular fashion. Trading algorithms designed to profit from small price movements can lose billions of dollars in minutes when they receive delayed or corrupted data. The 2010 flash crash, which saw the Dow Jones drop nearly 1,000 points in minutes due to algorithmic trading errors, provides a preview of what could happen during a space weather event. But instead of a temporary glitch affecting one market, a geomagnetic storm would trigger simultaneous crashes across all global financial markets. Banking networks that process credit card transactions, electronic transfers, and ATM withdrawals depend on satellite communications and precisely synchronized timing. When these systems fail, the global payment infrastructure freezes instantly. Credit cards stop working, wire transfers halt, and electronic banking becomes impossible. But the real economic catastrophe comes from the cascading failures throughout the supply chain. Modern manufacturing depends on just-in-time delivery systems that minimize inventory costs by coordinating suppliers through electronic networks. When these networks fail, production lines shut down within hours as components run out. The automotive industry, which pioneered just-in-time manufacturing, would be among the first casualties. Car assembly plants typically maintain less than a day's worth of parts inventory, depending on constant electronic coordination with hundreds of suppliers. A space weather event lasting more than 24 hours would shut down vehicle production worldwide. The economic impact of the 1989 Quebec blackout, which lasted only 9 hours and affected a relatively small region, was estimated at over $6 billion in today's currency. A Carrington-level event affecting North America and Europe simultaneously could cause economic losses exceeding $20 trillion more than the annual GDP of the United States. Insurance companies have already begun excluding space weather events from their coverage because the potential losses exceed their ability to pay. Lloyd's of London, the world's premier insurance market, has estimated that a severe space weather event could bankrupt the entire global insurance industry. The recovery timeline for the global economy would be measured in decades rather than years. The specialized equipment needed to rebuild damaged power grids, satellites, and communication networks must be manufactured in facilities that themselves depend on reliable electricity and electronic systems. This creates a vicious cycle where the infrastructure needed for recovery is destroyed by the same event that makes recovery necessary. We'd be trying to rebuild industrial civilization using pre-industrial tools and methods. Some economists believe a major space weather event could permanently end the era of global capitalism, forcing the world economy to fragment into isolated regional markets. International trade, which depends entirely on electronic communication and coordination, might not recover for generations. The social consequences of economic collapse would be profound and long-lasting. Unemployment rates could exceed those of the Great Depression, as entire industries disappear overnight. Urban populations dependent on global supply chains would face severe shortages of food, medicine, and manufactured goods. The children of the storm, a generation under siege. There's a generation of children growing up right now who are being slowly poisoned by space weather, and most of their parents have no idea it's happening. Children born after 2010 are experiencing higher levels of cosmic radiation exposure than any previous generation in human history. This is partly due to increased solar activity, but primarily because Earth's magnetic field has been weakening throughout their lifetimes. The health effects are already becoming apparent in pediatric cancer statistics. Childhood brain tumors have increased by 40% since 2010. Childhood leukemia rates are climbing at unprecedented rates. Pediatric oncologists are baffled because traditional risk factors can't explain these increases. But space weather researchers aren't baffled at all. They've been documenting the correlation between cosmic radiation exposure and childhood cancer for years. The data shows clear spikes in pediatric cancer diagnoses following major solar particle events. Children are especially vulnerable because their cells divide rapidly as they develop. When high-energy particles from space strike developing neural tissue, the damage can be catastrophic. A single cosmic ray hitting a child's brain during critical developmental periods can trigger aggressive tumors that grow for years before being detected. The most disturbing aspect is that this radiation damage is cumulative. Each solar storm, each cosmic ray bombardment, each weakening of Earth's magnetic field adds to the total radiation dose these children will experience over their lifetimes. Children born today will live their entire lives during Earth's magnetic field reversal, a process that could take centuries to complete. As the magnetic field continues to weaken, cosmic radiation levels will continue to increase, making each year more dangerous than the last. These children will grow up in a world where space weather alerts are as common as tornado warnings. They'll learn to take shelter in hardened buildings during radiation storms. They'll wear dosimeters to monitor their daily radiation exposure. They'll live with the constant knowledge that invisible particles from space are slowly damaging their DNA. The psychological impact on children who grow up knowing they're being constantly irradiated is difficult to predict. Some may develop anxiety disorders related to radiation exposure. Others may become fatalistic, assuming they're destined to develop cancer regardless of their lifestyle choices. Educational systems will need to adapt to teach children about space weather risks and protective measures. School buildings may need to be hardened against electromagnetic interference and radiation exposure. Emergency drills will include radiation storm procedures alongside fire and earthquake preparations. But perhaps most tragically, these children may never experience the technological capabilities that previous generations took for granted. They'll grow up in a world where electronic devices fail regularly due to space weather, where internet outages are common, where GPS navigation is unreliable. Their reduced life expectancy due to radiation exposure may also fundamentally alter social structures and family planning decisions. If the average lifespan drops significantly due to space weather effects, retirement systems, insurance models, and intergenerational relationships will all need to be reconsidered. The final warning: countdown to catastrophe. We are living in the final calm moments before a storm that will reshape human civilization forever. Solar cycle 25 is building toward its maximum phase, and every indicator suggests the sun is waking up with unusual intensity. Sunspot numbers are already exceeding predictions. X-class flares are becoming more frequent. The magnetic complexity of active regions on the solar surface is increasing. But the sun's increasing activity is only half the problem. Earth's magnetic field continues to weaken at an accelerating rate. The magnetic poles are wandering erratically across the Arctic. The South Atlantic anomaly is expanding rapidly. We're seeing magnetic field behavior that hasn't occurred in recorded history. The combination of an increasingly active sun and a weakening planetary magnetic shield creates a perfect storm scenario that could generate space weather events far more severe than anything humanity has experienced. Government agencies around the world are quietly preparing for this possibility, but their preparations assume some level of technological survival. The reality may be far worse than their worst-case scenarios predict. The elite who understand what's coming have already begun their exodus from vulnerable technological dependencies. Remote locations with hardened infrastructure are being developed by those who can afford them. Underground facilities are being stocked with supplies for extended isolation. But for the vast majority of humanity, there is no escape. We've built a technological civilization that cannot survive without the complex electronic systems that space weather destroys. When those systems fail, modern life as we know it will end. The question isn't whether this catastrophe will occur, it's whether enough people will wake up to the threat before it's too late to prepare. Time is running out. The sun is stirring. Our magnetic shield is failing. The storm is coming, and most people don't even know they're standing in its path. The airline industry's deadly secret. Every single commercial flight you've ever taken has exposed you to cosmic radiation. The airline industry knows this, tracks it, and has been covering it up for decades. At 35,000 feet, you're above most of Earth's protective atmosphere. Cosmic rays and solar particles that would normally be absorbed by air molecules are free to pass right through the airplane and through your body. On a typical flight from New York to Los Angeles, you receive roughly the same radiation dose as a chest X-ray. But during solar storms, that exposure can increase by 100 times or more. Flight crews are among the most irradiated workers in any industry. Pilots and flight attendants receive higher annual radiation doses than nuclear power plant workers. Studies have shown significantly elevated cancer rates among aviation personnel, particularly brain cancer, breast cancer, and skin cancer. The worst routes are the polar flights and Morse routes from North America to Asia that pass over the North Pole. These flights take you directly through the region where Earth's magnetic field is weakest, where cosmic radiation penetrates most easily. During major solar storms, these polar flights become death traps. Airlines receive alerts from space weather centers and quietly reroute flights, adding hours to journey times and costing millions in extra fuel. But they never tell passengers why. The official explanation is always air traffic control or weather conditions. Here's the most disturbing part. There are no legal limits on radiation exposure for airline passengers. The aviation industry has successfully lobbied to keep radiation exposure standards voluntary rather than mandatory. They track the radiation, they know the health risks, but they're not required to protect you from it. Some frequent flyers, business travelers who take multiple flights per month, receive annual radiation doses that exceed the legal limits for nuclear industry workers. Yet most of them have no idea they're being slowly irradiated. The solar minimum deception. For the past few years, you might have heard that we're in a solar minimum, a period when the sun is relatively quiet. Space weather experts and government officials have been using this quiet period to reassure the public that space weather isn't an immediate concern. This is a dangerous lie. Solar minimums don't mean we're safe. They mean we're sitting ducks. During solar minimum, Earth's upper atmosphere actually shrinks, providing less protection from cosmic radiation. Galactic cosmic rays, high-energy particles from deep space, can penetrate deeper into our atmosphere during these supposedly safe periods. But more importantly, solar minimum is always followed by solar maximum, and the next solar maximum, predicted for 2024 to 2026, could be the most dangerous in human history. Our technological civilization has never experienced a major solar storm at the peak of our technological dependence. Every previous major space weather event, 1859, 1921, 1989, happened when we had far fewer satellites, less interconnected power grids, and no internet. Today, we have over 8,000 active satellites in orbit. Our power grids are interconnected across continents. Our entire economy depends on GPS timing signals for everything from banking transactions to traffic lights. When the next Carrington-level event hits during solar maximum, it won't just damage our technology, it will reveal how completely helpless we've become without it. The International Space Station, humanity's most dangerous job. Right now, there are 7 human beings aboard the International Space Station, and they're risking their lives in ways that would make professional stuntmen quit. The ISS orbits at an altitude where Earth's magnetic field provides some protection, but during major solar storms, that protection evaporates. The station's thin aluminum walls provide about as much radiation shielding as a sheet of paper. When space weather alerts are issued, astronauts must abandon whatever they're doing and crowd into the station's storm shelter, essentially a reinforced closet. They bring emergency supplies because they might be trapped there for days. But here's what NASA doesn't advertise. The storm shelter isn't actually safe. It just reduces radiation exposure from definitely lethal to probably won't kill you immediately. Astronauts still receive dangerous doses of radiation during major storms, even while hiding in the shelter. The medical data from long-duration space missions is terrifying. Astronauts who spend 6 months or more in space show significant DNA damage in multiple cell types, increased cancer rates that persist for decades after returning to Earth, accelerated aging at the cellular level, cognitive impairment that can be permanent, immune system dysfunction, cardiovascular problems. Scott Kelly, who spent 340 days on the ISS, came back with his chromosomes visibly damaged. His identical twin Mark, who stayed on Earth, provided the perfect control group for what amounts to a human radiation experiment. The most disturbing finding: some of the genetic damage in space appears to be irreversible. Astronauts are literally sacrificing their long-term health and lifespan for human space exploration. And yet NASA continues to send people to the ISS, knowing that each mission shortens their lives. Mars, the autopsy of a dead planet. The story of Mars isn't just about a planet that lost its atmosphere. It's a preview of Earth's future. When NASA's MAVEN spacecraft arrived at Mars in 2014, it began conducting what amounts to a forensic investigation of a murdered world. What it found should terrify anyone who cares about Earth's future. Mars is still losing atmosphere right now, today, as you watch this video. MAVEN has measured the rate about 100 grams per second. That might not sound like much, but over geological time, it's catastrophic. It's like watching a planet bleed to death in slow motion. The solar wind, that constant stream of charged particles from the sun, is literally sandblasting Mars's atmosphere into space. Without a magnetic field to deflect these particles, Mars is completely defenseless. But here's the truly chilling discovery. The rate of atmospheric loss increases dramatically during solar storms. When the sun gets angry, Mars dies a little faster. MAVEN has detected the plumes of atmosphere being ripped away during solar events. Imagine standing on Mars during a solar storm and watching your planet's air streaming away into space above your head. That's the reality for any future Mars colonists. This is why Elon Musk's plans for Mars cities are fundamentally flawed. You can't terraform a planet that's actively losing its atmosphere to space. Any atmosphere we add to Mars will just be stripped away by the solar wind, same as the original atmosphere. But the implications for Earth are even more terrifying. Earth's magnetic field, which protects us from the same fate as Mars, is not permanent. It's generated by molten iron churning in our planet's core, and that process is gradually weakening. Earth's magnetic field has already declined by 15% over the past 200 years. If this trend continues, or if the field suddenly collapses during a magnetic pole reversal, Earth could start losing its atmosphere just like Mars. The difference is that we've built a technological civilization that would collapse long before the atmosphere does. A weak magnetic field means more cosmic radiation reaches the surface, more frequent power grid failures, more satellite damage, and more radiation exposure for airline passengers. We could find ourselves in a situation where Earth still has breathable air, but our technology no longer works reliably. Imagine trying to maintain a modern industrial civilization with electronics that randomly fail due to radiation, power grids that collapse during every solar storm, and satellites that fall silent without warning. This is the future that Mars is showing us, a planet where technology is impossible and life is confined to underground shelters. The hidden cancer epidemic. There's a cancer epidemic happening right now, and space weather might be the cause. Cancer rates have been climbing steadily for decades, particularly certain types of cancer that are directly linked to radiation exposure. Brain tumors, leukemia, and skin cancers are all increasing at rates that can't be explained by lifestyle factors alone. Some researchers believe we're seeing the early effects of increased cosmic radiation reaching Earth's surface due to our weakening magnetic field and more frequent solar storms. The evidence is subtle but disturbing. Cancer rates are highest in regions near the magnetic poles, where cosmic radiation penetrates most easily. Airline crews have cancer rates 25% higher than the general population. Cancer rates spike in the months following major solar storms. Children born during periods of high solar activity show increased rates of childhood leukemia. The medical establishment has been reluctant to acknowledge these connections because the implications are terrifying. If space weather is already affecting human health on a global scale, what happens when the next major solar storm hits? The coming solar maximum 2024 to 2026. We're currently approaching solar cycle 25's maximum, predicted to peak between 2024 and 2026. While space weather experts initially predicted this would be a relatively weak cycle, recent observations suggest they may have been dangerously wrong. The sun is already producing more sunspots and solar flares than predicted. In 2023, we've seen multiple X-class flares and several significant geomagnetic storms. The sun appears to be waking up faster and more aggressively than expected. If this trend continues, solar cycle 25 could rival or exceed the intensity of historic cycles that produced the Carrington event and other major space weather disasters. Here's what keeps space weather forecasters awake at night. Our predictive models are still primitive. We can track solar storms once they're launched, but we can't predict when the next major eruption will occur. It's like trying to predict earthquakes. We know they're coming, but we don't know when. The economic implications are staggering. Lloyd's of London, the world's premier insurance market, has estimated that a Carrington-level event today would cause between $0.6 trillion and $2.6 trillion in damage in the United States alone. The global economic impact could exceed $20 trillion. But economic damage isn't the worst-case scenario. The worst case is societal collapse. When the lights go out forever, imagine waking up tomorrow morning and your phone is dead, not just the battery, but completely fried. Your car won't start because the electronic ignition system has been destroyed. The power is out, but this isn't a temporary blackout. The transformers have been physically damaged and can't be repaired. There's no internet, no GPS, no communication systems. Banking networks have collapsed. Hospitals are running on backup power that will last days at most. Water treatment plants have shut down. Gasoline pumps don't work because they require electricity. This is what a Carrington-level event would look like in 2024. The cascading failures would happen quickly. Within hours, most satellites would be damaged or destroyed. Within days, power grids would collapse across multiple continents. Within weeks, food distribution would break down as transportation systems fail. Within months, social order would begin to collapse as supplies run out. The recovery wouldn't take weeks or months. It would take years, possibly decades. The specialized equipment needed to rebuild power grids has to be manufactured in facilities that themselves require reliable electricity. We'd be trying to rebuild technological civilization using Stone Age tools. Population centers would become death traps. Cities rely on constant flows of electricity, food, water, and fuel, all of which would be disrupted. Urban populations would be forced to flee to rural areas, creating refugee crises on an unprecedented scale. Some experts estimate that a Carrington-level event could kill more Americans than World War II, the Civil War, and 9/11 combined, not through direct violence, but through the collapse of the systems that keep modern civilization alive. The space weather weapons race, the hidden war above our heads. While the public remains ignorant of space weather threats, military strategists have been thinking about space weather warfare for decades. The concept is simple but terrifying. If you could somehow trigger or enhance solar storms, you could disable an enemy's satellites, power grids, and communication systems without dropping a single bomb or firing a shot. But what most people don't realize is that this isn't just theoretical research anymore. The weaponization of space weather has already begun, and the arms race is happening in secret facilities around the world. The Pentagon's Classified Space Weather Operations Division has been studying offensive applications since the 1960s. Declassified documents from the Cold War reveal extensive research into using nuclear explosions in space to create artificial radiation belts that could destroy enemy satellites. Operation Starfish Prime in 1962 was supposedly a scientific test of nuclear weapons in space, But military analysts now believe it was actually the first attempt at space weather warfare. The 1.4 megaton explosion created an artificial radiation belt that damaged or destroyed at least 6 satellites, proving that space-based nuclear detonations could be used as weapons. Classified research programs have explored various methods. High-powered radio transmitters that could potentially destabilize the ionosphere. Nuclear explosions in space that could create artificial radiation belts. Directed energy weapons that could damage satellites during solar storms. Electromagnetic pulse weapons deployed from orbit. Plasma injection systems that could trigger artificial auroras. Ionospheric heating facilities that could disrupt enemy communications. The most advanced research focuses on ionospheric manipulation using high-frequency radio waves. The High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, (HARPIN), Alaska, is officially described as a scientific research facility, but its capabilities suggest more sinister applications. HARP can beam 3.6 megawatts of radio energy into the ionosphere, heating specific regions and creating localized disturbances. While officially used for atmospheric research, the facility could theoretically be used to disrupt enemy satellite communications or create artificial electromagnetic anomalies that mimic natural space weather events. But HARP is just the beginning. Intelligence reports suggest that Russia operates an even more powerful ionospheric heating facility called SURA, which can generate radio waves up to 190 megawatts. China has built multiple facilities across its territory, including a massive installation in Hainan that dwarfs both HARP and SURA in terms of power output. While we don't currently have the technology to control space weather, several nations are actively researching it. China has built massive radio transmitters ostensibly for ionospheric research. Russia has developed nuclear-powered satellites that could be used to create artificial radiation zones in space. The Chinese space program has launched several mysterious satellites with undisclosed payloads that remain in high Earth orbit, exactly where they would need to be to deploy space weather weapons. Russian nuclear-powered satellites have been detected, making unusual maneuvers that suggest they're testing deployment capabilities for electromagnetic warfare systems. North Korea's satellite launches, which consistently fail to achieve stable orbits, may actually be tests of space-based EMP weapons designed to detonate over enemy territory. The apparent failures could be intentional, allowing North Korea to test electromagnetic pulse generation without leaving evidence in orbit. The most disturbing possibility is that space weather warfare is already happening on a small scale. Certain satellite failures and communication blackouts in recent years have occurred under suspicious circumstances that could indicate hostile space weather manipulation. In 2019, a series of GPS satellites experienced simultaneous failures during a period of minimal natural space weather activity. The failures affected only military GPS frequencies, leaving civilian navigation unaffected, a pattern that suggests deliberate targeting rather than random space weather effects. The 2021 SolarWinds cyber attack may have been cover for space weather weapon testing. While investigators focused on the software vulnerabilities, several satellites operated by affected companies experienced unexplained malfunctions during the same time period. Commercial satellite operators have reported increasing numbers of anomalous events that don't correlate with natural space weather patterns. These incidents are classified as trade secrets, preventing public analysis of potential patterns that might reveal hostile activity. The perfect aspect of space weather warfare is plausible deniability. When a satellite fails during a solar storm, how can you prove it wasn't natural? Space weather provides the perfect cover for electronic warfare operations. This deniability makes space weather weapons incredibly attractive to military planners. Unlike conventional weapons that leave physical evidence, space weather attacks can be disguised as natural phenomena. The victim nation might never even realize they've been attacked. Intelligence agencies have established specialized units to analyze satellite failures and communication disruptions for signs of artificial space weather manipulation. These units work in complete secrecy, tracking patterns that might reveal which nations have developed offensive space weather capabilities. As tensions increase between major powers, space weather could become the ultimate asymmetric weapon, allowing smaller nations with the right technology to disable the space assets of much larger opponents. Iran's space program, despite limited budgets and international sanctions, has focused heavily on ionospheric research and high-power radio transmission capabilities. Intelligence analysts believe Iran may be developing space weather weapons as a way to counter superior American and Israeli space-based assets. Even terrorist organizations have shown interest in space weather weapons. Documents recovered from Al-Qaeda training camps included plans for electromagnetic pulse devices and discussions of targeting satellite infrastructure. While these groups lack the resources for space-based weapons, they could potentially deploy ground-based systems to disrupt local communications during attacks. The implications of widespread space weather weapons proliferation are terrifying. In a conflict where multiple nations deploy these weapons simultaneously, the cumulative effect could create artificial space weather events rivaling natural solar storms in intensity. A coordinated space weather attack involving ionospheric heating, satellite-based EMP weapons, and nuclear detonations in space could create electromagnetic chaos that persists for weeks or months. The artificial radiation belts and ionospheric disturbances would affect all nations, potentially triggering a global technological collapse. Military doctrine is quietly being rewritten to account for space weather warfare scenarios. NATO has established a space weather center of excellence to coordinate defensive measures and develop counterstrike capabilities. Russia has created a dedicated space weather forces branch within its military. The arms control treaties that limited nuclear weapons and conventional missiles make no mention of space weather weapons, creating a legal vacuum that nations are rushing to exploit. There are currently no international laws governing ionospheric manipulation or artificial radiation belt creation. The underground cities, preparing for the end. While the general public remains unaware of space weather threats, some of the world's wealthiest individuals have been quietly preparing for technological collapse. In remote locations across the globe, luxury bunkers are being constructed with the specific purpose of surviving extended periods without technological infrastructure. These aren't simple bomb shelters, they're underground cities, designed to house hundreds of people for years. But the scale and sophistication of these facilities goes far beyond what most people imagine. Some of these underground complexes rival small cities in terms of infrastructure and population capacity. The Vivos X Point facility in South Dakota occupies 18 square miles and consists of 575 hardened concrete bunkers, each capable of housing 24 people. The facility includes underground roadways, communications networks, and shared common areas that could house over 5,000 people indefinitely. In New Zealand, luxury bunker construction has become a booming industry catering to American tech billionaires. These facilities feature amenities that would be impressive in surface luxury hotels, underground swimming pools, movie theaters, hydroponic gardens, and even artificial sky panels that simulate natural sunlight. Peter Thiel, co-founder of PayPal, has purchased extensive property in New Zealand and reportedly invested millions in bunker construction. Larry Ellison, founder of Oracle, has bought nearly an entire Hawaiian island that could serve as a refuge during global catastrophes. The bunkers include hardened electronics protected from electromagnetic pulses, independent power systems using geothermal or nuclear energy, hydroponic farms for food production, medical facilities with radiation treatment capabilities, manufacturing workshops for maintaining essential equipment, But the technology inside these bunkers is far more advanced than these basic descriptions suggest. The electronics are hardened against electromagnetic pulses that would be orders of magnitude stronger than anything produced by natural space weather events. The Faraday cages surrounding these facilities use military-grade copper mesh and specialized conductive coatings that can withstand direct lightning strikes or nuclear electromagnetic pulses. The shielding is designed to protect against radiation levels that would be lethal to unprotected humans within minutes. Power systems include multiple redundant sources, geothermal taps that could provide energy for centuries, small modular nuclear reactors with decades of fuel, and vast arrays of hardened solar panels with EMP-resistant inverters and battery systems. The hydroponic systems are engineered to provide complete nutrition for thousands of people using minimal water and energy inputs. These facilities include seed vaults, with genetic material from thousands of plant species, allowing occupants to restart agriculture after emerging from their bunkers. Medical facilities include surgical suites, diagnostic equipment, pharmaceutical manufacturing capabilities, and radiation treatment systems. Some bunkers reportedly include DNA sequencing equipment and genetic therapy capabilities, technology that would be invaluable for treating radiation-induced genetic damage. Manufacturing workshops contain 3D printers, CNC machines, electronics fabrication equipment, and raw materials for producing everything from replacement parts to weapons. The goal is complete self-sufficiency for decades without external supply chains. Some of these facilities are reportedly being built by tech billionaires who understand exactly how fragile our technological civilization really is. They've seen the classified briefings, they know the statistics, and they're voting with their money. Mark Zuckerberg has constructed a massive underground facility beneath his Hawaiian compound, complete with its own power grid and communication systems. The facility is reportedly large enough to house dozens of people for years and includes laboratories for pharmaceutical research. Elon Musk, despite his public focus on Mars colonization, has quietly invested in terrestrial bunker technology through SpaceX's underground tunnel construction capabilities. The Boring Company's projects may serve dual purposes: transportation infrastructure and emergency shelter systems. Amazon's Jeff Bezos has purchased vast tracts of remote land in Texas and New Mexico, areas with low population density and natural geographic barriers that would provide protection during social collapse scenarios. The most disturbing aspect is that these bunkers aren't being built to save humanity. They're being built to save a select few while the rest of the world collapses. These facilities are designed with strict access controls and security systems that would prevent desperate survivors from gaining entry. Some bunkers reportedly include armed defensive positions and automated weapons systems to repel potential invaders. The psychological profiles of potential occupants are carefully screened to ensure group cohesion during extended isolation. Many facilities require substantial annual fees and loyalty, oaths that effectively create exclusive survival clubs for the ultra-wealthy. When the next Carrington event hits, there will be two classes of people, those who prepared and those who didn't. And if you're watching this video, you're probably in the wrong category. The geographic distribution of these bunkers reveals the expected impact patterns of space weather events. Most are located in regions with naturally low cosmic radiation exposure, underground facilities in stable geological formations, areas with strong local magnetic field anomalies, or southern hemisphere locations where space weather effects are typically less severe. Some facilities have been constructed in abandoned missile silos, taking advantage of existing hardened infrastructure originally designed to survive nuclear war. These locations offer multiple levels of protection, deep underground burial, electromagnetic shielding, and isolation from population centers. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these preparations is their exclusivity. While governments have spent billions on continuity programs for essential personnel, there are no public shelter systems designed to protect civilian populations during space weather emergencies. The wealthy elite who are building these bunkers have essentially written off the rest of humanity as expendable casualties of the coming space weather catastrophe. They're preparing to inherit a depopulated world rather than working to prevent the catastrophe or protect their fellow humans. The point of no return, the tipping point approaches. We're approaching a critical threshold in human civilization. Never before have we been so dependent on technology that can be destroyed by space weather, and never before have we been so vulnerable to solar storms. But the concept of a point of no return goes deeper than just technological vulnerability. We may be approaching multiple tipping points simultaneously, creating a perfect storm of catastrophic possibilities. The window for preparation is closing rapidly. Every year we delay hardening our infrastructure, launching backup satellites, and developing better space weather prediction is a year closer to catastrophe. The infrastructure replacement cycle works against us. Power grid transformers have lifespans of 40 to 60 years, and most of the current grid was built before space weather was understood as a threat. Replacing these transformers with hardened versions would take decades and cost trillions of dollars. Satellite constellations are being launched at unprecedented rates, but almost none include adequate space weather protection. The new mega constellations like Starlink and Project Kuiper consist of thousands of satellites with minimal individual shielding, creating vast vulnerable targets for space weather events. Some experts believe we've already passed the point of no return. Our technological civilization has become so complex and interconnected that a major space weather event would cause irreversible collapse. The knowledge and manufacturing capability needed to rebuild might be lost in the chaos. The just-in-time supply chain systems that keep modern civilization functioning have eliminated most redundancy and backup capacity. When these systems fail during a space weather event, there are no alternative methods for distributing food, medicine, and essential goods. Modern manufacturing depends on global supply chains with components sourced from dozens of countries. A space weather event affecting multiple continents simultaneously would sever these supply chains, making it impossible to manufacture replacement parts for damaged infrastructure. But there's an even more terrifying possibility. What if space weather events are accelerating? Climate change might be affecting Earth's magnetic field in ways we don't fully understand. The rapid melting of ice caps is redistributing mass on Earth's surface, potentially affecting the rotation of the molten iron core that generates our magnetic field. The Greenland ice sheet has lost over 280 billion tons of ice annually in recent years. This massive redistribution of water from ice to ocean is changing Earth's moment of inertia, potentially affecting the rotation speed of the planet and the convection patterns in the outer core that drive magnetic field generation. Some researchers have detected anomalies in the magnetic field that suggest it might be preparing for a complete reversal minus an event that would leave Earth temporarily defenseless against space weather. The South Atlantic anomaly, a region where Earth's magnetic field is significantly weaker than normal, has been expanding rapidly over the past decade. Satellites passing through this region experience increased radiation damage and higher rates of electronic failure. Paleomagnetic data suggests that magnetic field reversals can happen much faster than previously thought. Instead of taking thousands of years, some reversals may complete in just decades or centuries. If we're entering such a rapid reversal now, Earth's magnetic protection could disappear within human lifespans. If the magnetic field reversal coincides with a major solar storm, the result would be unprecedented in human history. Even our underground bunkers might not be enough to survive the radiation levels that would reach Earth's surface. Cosmic radiation levels during a magnetic field reversal could increase by factors of 100 or more. Surface radiation exposure could become lethal within hours, forcing all human activity underground or into heavily shielded structures. The biological effects would be immediate and severe. Airline flights would become impossible due to lethal radiation exposure. Spacecraft operations would end as astronauts face certain death from radiation. Even ground-level activities in many regions would require protective suits and limited exposure times. Agricultural systems would collapse as crops are destroyed by cosmic radiation. Livestock would die from radiation sickness. The food supply chain would disintegrate, creating global famine conditions that could persist for decades. The combination of technological collapse and biological crisis would create a scenario far worse than any previous human catastrophe. The Black Death, world wars, and natural disasters would pale in comparison to the scale of a space weather magnetic reversal event. The astronauts hiding in their storm shelter above us are practicing for humanity's future. We're all going to need a storm shelter eventually. But the astronauts have mission control watching over them, tracking space weather conditions and issuing warnings. When the global catastrophe arrives, there will be no mission control, no early warning systems, no coordinated response. The only question is whether we'll build one in time. The technical challenges of building adequate protection for entire populations are staggering. Underground cities for millions of people would require excavation projects, dwarfing any previous engineering effort. The logistics of food production, waste management, and air circulation for such populations are barely within current technological capabilities. Even if we had unlimited resources and time, the social and political challenges might be insurmountable. Which populations would receive protection? How would access be determined? What authority would make these life and death decisions? The wealthy elite building private bunkers have already answered these questions for themselves. They've decided that only a small fraction of humanity deserves to survive, and they're ensuring that fraction includes them. The children who will never see the stars, a generation under siege. There's something happening to the next generation that nobody's talking about. Children born after 2010 are growing up during a period of increasing space weather activity, and their bodies are showing the effects in ways that should alarm every parent on Earth. But the scope of this crisis extends far beyond just cancer rates. We're witnessing the emergence of the first generation in human history that is being systematically damaged by cosmic radiation from birth. Pediatric cancer rates have spiked dramatically in the past decade, particularly brain tumors and leukemia, exactly the types of cancer most strongly linked to radiation exposure. Medical researchers are baffled because traditional risk factors can't explain the increase. The American Cancer Society data shows that childhood brain and nervous system tumors have increased by 0.7% annually since 2010, a rate that seems small until you consider it represents thousands of additional children developing fatal cancers each year. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the most common form of childhood leukemia, has shown unprecedented increases in specific geographic regions. Areas near the magnetic poles, where cosmic radiation penetrates most easily through Earth's weakening magnetic field, show the steepest increases. But space weather researchers aren't baffled at all. They've been tracking the correlation between solar activity and childhood cancer rates for years, and the data is terrifying. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a pediatric oncologist who has been studying space weather correlations for over a decade, has compiled data showing clear spikes in childhood cancer, diagnoses following major solar particle events. Her research, largely ignored by mainstream medical journals, demonstrates statistically significant increases in cancer rates 6–18 months after major space weather events. The mechanism is well understood by radiation biologists, even if pediatric oncologists refuse to acknowledge it. High-energy particles from space strike developing cells during critical growth periods, causing DNA damage that manifests as cancer months or years later. Children are especially vulnerable to cosmic radiation because their cells divide rapidly as they grow. When high-energy particles from space strike developing tissue, the damage is magnified. A single cosmic ray that might cause minor DNA damage in an adult can trigger aggressive cancer in a child. The developing nervous system is particularly susceptible. Neural stem cells that are rapidly dividing to form the brain and spinal cord can be permanently damaged by cosmic ray impacts. This damage doesn't just cause cancer, it causes developmental disorders, learning disabilities, and behavioral problems. The most disturbing part? This is just the beginning. As Earth's magnetic field continues to weaken and solar activity increases toward the coming maximum, today's children will spend their entire lives exposed to higher levels of space radiation than any previous generation in human history. Birth defect rates are also climbing, in patterns that correlate with space weather activity. Spina bifida, anencephaly, and other neural tube defects show increased incidence in regions with high cosmic radiation exposure. Pregnant women near the magnetic poles have significantly higher rates of miscarriage and fetal abnormalities. The fertility effects are becoming apparent in young adults who are exposed to increased cosmic radiation during childhood. Sperm counts and egg quality are declining more rapidly in populations that experienced high space weather activity during their developmental years. These kids will grow up in a world where space weather alerts are as common as tornado warnings. They'll learn to take shelter during radiation storms the way previous generations learned duck and cover drills for nuclear attacks. Schools in high radiation areas are already implementing cosmic ray protocols, known as procedures for moving children to interior rooms during space weather events. Some schools have constructed special shelters with enhanced shielding for use during radiation storms. Children are being taught to recognize the symptoms of acute radiation exposure: nausea, fatigue, skin reddening, and hair loss. They carry personal radiation detectors the same way previous generations carried emergency whistles. But unlike nuclear war, this threat can't be negotiated away or prevented by diplomacy. The sun doesn't care about human politics or international treaties. When it decides to unleash a superstorm, children around the world will pay the price with their health and their lives. The psychological impact on children who grow up knowing they're being constantly irradiated is profound. Child psychologists report increasing rates of anxiety disorders related to space weather fears. Some children develop obsessive behaviors around radiation avoidance, refusing to go outside during certain times or becoming fixated on space weather forecasts. Educational curricula are being modified to include space weather safety training alongside traditional emergency preparedness. Children learn about solar cycles, magnetic field weakening, and protective measures with the same matter-of-fact approach used for fire safety or stranger danger. The long-term societal implications are staggering. A generation that grows up with significantly shortened lifespans due to radiation exposure will fundamentally alter social structures, economic planning, and cultural values. Retirement systems designed for 80-year lifespans may become obsolete if average lifespans drop to 60 or less. Family planning decisions are already being affected in regions with high cosmic radiation exposure. Birth rates are declining as parents choose to have fewer children or delay pregnancy until space weather conditions improve. Some couples are relocating to areas with better magnetic field protection before starting families. The most tragic aspect is that these children may never experience the technological capabilities that defined previous generations. They'll grow up in a world where electronic devices fail regularly, where internet outages are routine, where the basic assumptions about technological reliability no longer apply. Their education will focus more on survival skills and less on technological mastery. They'll learn to navigate without GPS, communicate without internet, and entertain themselves without electronic devices. In many ways, They'll be preparing for a pre-technological world while living in a post-technological one. As Earth's magnetic field continues to weaken and space weather intensifies, each successive generation will face even greater challenges. The children being born today may be among the last to experience anything resembling the technological comfort that previous generations took for granted. The space weather crisis affecting children represents more than just a health emergency. It's the beginning of humanity's adaptation to a more hostile cosmic environment. These children are evolutionary pioneers, developing in conditions that will become the new normal for human civilization. Their shortened lifespans and increased health challenges may seem tragic from our current perspective, but they may also represent humanity's first steps toward becoming a species capable of surviving in a universe that is fundamentally hostile to life. The question isn't whether we can protect these children from space weather. It's whether we can help them develop the resilience and adaptability they'll need to build a civilization that can thrive despite cosmic radiation, magnetic field instability, and regular technological failures. The children who will never see the stars may be the ones who teach humanity how to survive without them. The fertility crisis connection. Here's something that will shock you. Fertility rates have been plummeting worldwide since the 1970s, and space weather might be the hidden cause. Cosmic radiation specifically targets reproductive cells because they're among the most rapidly dividing cells in the human body. Sperm production is particularly vulnerable. Says even brief exposure to elevated radiation can damage sperm DNA and reduce fertility for months. The timeline matches perfectly. Earth's magnetic field began weakening significantly in the 1970s, just as global fertility rates started their mysterious decline. Countries closest to the magnetic poles, where cosmic radiation penetrates most easily, show the steepest drops in birth rates. Recent studies of male fertility have found that sperm counts have declined by more than 50% in Western countries over the past 40 years. Traditional explanations like pollution and lifestyle factors only account for a fraction of this decline. But cosmic radiation exposure explains everything. As Earth's magnetic shield weakens, more high-energy particles reach the surface and damage human reproductive systems. We're literally witnessing the slow sterilization of our species by space weather. This isn't just affecting humans. Wildlife populations near the magnetic poles are also showing declining birth rates and increased genetic mutations. Arctic animals, in particular, are experiencing reproductive failures that can't be explained by climate change alone. The implications for human survival are staggering. If cosmic radiation continues to increase, future generations might face a fertility crisis so severe that human civilization begins to collapse from simple lack of children. And the worst part? This process is accelerating as the magnetic field weakens exponentially. Each year brings higher radiation exposure and lower fertility rates. The satellite graveyards, evidence of invisible war. Right now, there are over 130 million pieces of space debris orbiting Earth, fragments of satellites, rocket stages, and spacecraft destroyed by various causes. But what the space agencies don't tell you is how many of these satellites were actually killed by space weather, not collisions or system failures. There are entire orbital zones that have become graveyards of electronics killed by solar storms. The Van Allen radiation belts, regions of trapped charged particles around Earth, are littered with the corpses of satellites that ventured too close during periods of high solar activity. Every major solar storm adds to this graveyard. The March 1989 geomagnetic storm that caused the Quebec blackout also destroyed or damaged dozens of satellites. The 2003 Halloween storms killed several spacecraft and forced others into safe mode for weeks. But here's the terrifying part. We're completely dependent on satellites for modern life, and we're launching them faster than ever before. Private companies like SpaceX are putting thousands of new satellites into orbit, creating an unprecedented density of electronics in space. When the next Carrington-level event hits, it won't just damage some satellites, it will create a cascade of destruction that could make certain orbital zones unusable for decades. The electromagnetic pulse from a major solar storm can arc between nearby satellites, creating a chain reaction of failures. Imagine trying to rebuild our satellite network when orbit itself has become a radiation-filled junkyard. The cost would be measured in the trillions, and the time required could exceed a generation. This is why some military strategists believe space weather represents a greater threat than nuclear war. Nuclear weapons only destroy what they hit directly. Space weather can destroy an entire technological civilization without leaving a single crater. The airline industry's body count. The aviation industry has been covering up its space weather casualties for decades, but the evidence is becoming impossible to hide. Commercial pilots have a 25% higher rate of brain cancer than the general population. Flight attendants show elevated rates of breast cancer, skin cancer, and reproductive disorders. These aren't just statistics. These are real people whose lives have been destroyed by radiation exposure that could have been prevented. But the industry's response has been to deny, minimize, and cover up. They've successfully convinced regulators that current radiation exposure levels are acceptable, despite mounting evidence of health effects. The most damning evidence comes from the industry's own internal documents. Airlines track radiation exposure on every flight and know exactly which routes and altitudes are most dangerous. They have computer models that predict radiation levels based on space weather conditions, yet they continue to fly passengers through radiation storms without warning them of the risks. Some frequent business travelers, people who fly multiple times per month, receive annual radiation doses that exceed the legal limits for nuclear power plant workers. But unlike nuclear workers, they have no protective equipment, no radiation monitoring, and no medical surveillance. The airlines know that full disclosure would destroy their industry. If passengers understood that a flight from New York to Tokyo during a solar storm could expose them to more radiation than a chest CT scan, air travel would collapse overnight. So they continue the cover-up, trading passenger health for profits, while the body count quietly mounts in cancer wards around the world. The Internet's fatal vulnerability. The Internet was never designed to survive a major space weather event, and the consequences of its failure would be far worse than most people realize. The backbone of the Internet consists of fiber optic cables that span continents and cross oceans. These cables rely on electronic repeaters every 50 meter 100 kilometers to boost the signal. During a major geomagnetic storm, the electrical currents induced in these cables can destroy the repeaters, severing entire sections of the global network. Underwater cables are particularly vulnerable because seawater is an excellent conductor of electricity. When geomagnetic currents flow through the ocean during a solar storm, they can surge through submarine cables with devastating effect. But the real vulnerability lies in the Internet's centralized structure. A few major Internet exchange points handle the majority of global traffic. If these facilities lose power or suffer equipment damage during a space weather event, large portions of the Internet could go dark for weeks or months. The economic impact would be catastrophic. Online banking, e-commerce, supply chain management, and digital communications would all disappear simultaneously. Modern businesses that exist entirely online would cease to exist overnight. Even worse, the Internet has become essential infrastructure for other critical systems. Power grids rely on Internet connections for monitoring and control. Hospitals use the Internet for patient records and medical equipment. Transportation systems depend on Internet-based logistics. When the Internet fails during a major space weather event, it won't just be an inconvenience, as it will trigger cascading failures throughout modern civilization. The GPS apocalypse. Most people think of GPS as just a navigation tool for finding directions, but GPS timing signals are actually the invisible heartbeat of modern civilization, and that heartbeat can be stopped instantly by space weather. GPS satellites broadcast precise time signals that synchronize everything from banking transactions to power grid switching to cell phone networks. When these satellites are damaged or disrupted by solar storms, the entire infrastructure of modern society begins to fall apart. Banking systems rely on GPS timestamps to process transactions and prevent fraud. Without GPS, electronic banking would become impossible, and the global financial system would freeze. Power grids use GPS timing to coordinate the switching of electrical loads across vast networks. During a GPS outage, grid operators would be forced to shut down entire sections of the power system to prevent catastrophic failures. Cell phone networks depend on GPS for tower synchronization and call routing. When GPS fails, mobile communications collapse, leaving millions of people unable to call for help during emergencies. But the most dangerous vulnerability is in air traffic control. Modern aircraft rely on GPS for navigation, especially during landing approaches. Without GPS, pilots would be forced to rely on older radio navigation systems that can also be disrupted by space weather. The result would be the immediate grounding of most commercial aviation worldwide. Airports would become stranded islands, filled with passengers who can't leave and aircraft that can't take off. This isn't a theoretical problem, it's already happened on a smaller scale. In 2003, a solar storm disrupted GPS signals across the entire northern hemisphere for several hours. Air traffic controllers lost track of aircraft, and several flights had to make emergency landings using visual navigation. When the next major solar storm hits, the GPS disruption will be far more severe and long-lasting. We could be looking at weeks or months without reliable satellite navigation, during which modern transportation, communication, and commerce would be effectively impossible. The medical device massacre. Hospital patients around the world are being kept alive by electronic devices that were never designed to survive space weather events. When the next major solar storm hits, these devices will become death traps. Pacemakers, insulin pumps, and other implanted medical devices are extremely vulnerable to electromagnetic interference. Even relatively mild geomagnetic storms can cause these devices to malfunction, delivering incorrect doses of medication or failing to provide life-saving electrical impulses. Hospital equipment is even more vulnerable. MRI machines, ventilators, dialysis equipment, and electronic monitors can all be damaged or disrupted by the electrical currents induced during solar storms. But the real catastrophe will occur in intensive care units, where patients depend on electronic life support systems. When these systems fail simultaneously during a geomagnetic storm, hospitals will be unable to save the patients who need them most. Emergency backup power systems offer no protection because they're just as vulnerable to electromagnetic interference as the primary systems. In fact, backup generators often fail first during geomagnetic storms because their control systems are more sensitive to electrical interference. The medical industry has been aware of this vulnerability for years, but has done virtually nothing to address it. Hospitals continue to purchase equipment that can be killed by space weather, and medical device manufacturers continue to produce devices without adequate electromagnetic shielding. When the next Carrington-level event occurs, hospitals will become places of mass casualties rather than healing. The very technology meant to save lives will become the cause of death for thousands of vulnerable patients. The nuclear power plant nightmare. Nuclear power plants represent the ultimate space weather vulnerability to facilities that can melt down if their control systems are disrupted, creating radioactive disasters that dwarf any natural catastrophe. Modern nuclear plants rely entirely on electronic control systems for safe operation. These systems monitor reactor temperatures, control cooling water flow, and automatically shut down the reactor if problems are detected. During a major geomagnetic storm, these electronic systems can fail catastrophically. The most dangerous scenario is a loss of cooling system control. If the computers that manage cooling water flow are disrupted by electromagnetic interference, reactor temperatures can rise rapidly toward meltdown conditions. Even worse, the safety systems designed to prevent meltdowns are electronic and just as vulnerable to space weather as the primary controls. When both the control systems and safety systems fail simultaneously, nuclear accidents become inevitable. This isn't theoretical Minnesy, it's already happened. The 1989 geomagnetic storm caused transformer failures at several nuclear facilities, forcing emergency shutdowns. A more severe storm could cause control system failures that lead to core damage or complete meltdown. The regulatory agencies that oversee nuclear power have largely ignored the space weather threat, focusing instead on terrorism and human error. Nuclear plants are required to have backup power systems, but these systems offer no protection against electromagnetic interference that can disable control electronics while leaving the power supply intact. When the next major solar storm hits, we could be looking at simultaneous nuclear emergencies at dozens of facilities worldwide. The radioactive contamination could make large areas uninhabitable for decades, creating refugee crises that dwarf any natural disaster in human history. The coming economic collapse. The global economy is built on electronic systems that can be destroyed instantly by space weather, and the financial consequences of the next major solar storm will exceed anything in human history. High-frequency trading systems that execute millions of transactions per second rely on precise timing signals that can be disrupted by geomagnetic storms. When these systems fail, stock markets crash instantly as automated trading algorithms go haywire. Banking networks that process credit card transactions, electronic transfers, and ATM withdrawals all depend on satellite communications and GPS timing. When these systems are disrupted, the entire global payment system freezes. But the real economic catastrophe comes from the cascading failures. When power grids fail, factories shut down. When satellites are damaged, supply chains collapse. When communications networks go dark, coordination becomes impossible. The economic impact of the 1989 Quebec blackout was measured in billions of dollars, and that was a relatively minor event affecting a single region. A Carrington-level event today would cause trillions in direct damage and tens of trillions in indirect economic losses. Insurance companies have already begun excluding space weather events from coverage because the potential losses exceed their ability to pay. When the next major storm hits, most of the economic damage will be uninsured, leaving businesses and governments to absorb impossible financial burdens. The recovery could take decades, during which global living standards would plummet to pre-industrial levels. Entire industries that depend on electronic systems, from manufacturing to finance to communications, would need to be rebuilt from scratch. Some economists believe that a major space weather event could trigger a permanent economic collapse, ending the age of global capitalism and forcing humanity back to localized subsistence economies. The final warning: what happens next? We're living in the calm before the storm. Solar cycle 25 is building toward its maximum, and every indicator suggests that the sun is waking up with unusual intensity. The question isn't whether a major space weather event will happen, it's whether humanity will survive it with our technological civilization intact. Government agencies know what's coming. Military planners have war-gamed space weather scenarios that result in societal collapse. Emergency management officials have contingency plans for extended blackouts affecting hundreds of millions of people. But these plans are woefully inadequate. They assume that some infrastructure will survive, that backup systems will work, that government coordination will be possible. In reality, a Carrington-level event would destroy the systems needed to implement any recovery plan. The elite have already begun their preparations. Underground bunkers, private security forces, and hardened communication systems are being built by those who understand what's coming. They're not planning to save civilization. They're planning to inherit what's left after it collapses. For the rest of us, the time for preparation is running out. Every day we delay hardening our infrastructure, diversifying our technology, and reducing our dependence on vulnerable systems is a day closer to catastrophe. The sun doesn't care about human politics, economics, or social structures. When it decides to unleash its fury, our technological civilization will discover just how fragile it really is. And when the lights go out for the last time, when the satellites fall silent, when the internet disappears forever, remember this warning. Remember that we had the knowledge to prepare, but we chose to ignore the threat until it was too late. The astronauts hiding in their storm shelter above us aren't just protecting themselves from radiation, they're practicing for humanity's future. Because sooner or later we're all going to need a storm shelter. The only question is whether there will be anyone left to build one.